Welcome boys and girls, Costine here with a discussion about the late game issues in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Oftentimes when you see a DLC coming out or a major patch coming out or a racial rework coming out, you'll see plenty of people talking about how Creative Assembly has trivialized campaigns, they've added to the power creep, they've made campaigns for certain races, certain characters very easy. It affected dwarves when they got their rework in Thrones of Decay. It has affected Khorne and Arbol specifically with the Khorne rework of Omens of Destruction. And most recently, it has affected the Tomb Kings on Lizardman, though it is a bit hilarious thinking about the Tomb Kings because the comments there are from people saying, well, I play a Tomb King campaign and after a certain point, I'm just steamrolling everything with infinite armies, without a care in the world, with disposable free armies. But that was already the case before the Tomb King rework. The patch did not change it. And even with the dwarves, you look at dwarves, what did the dwarf rework really change for dwarves? Yes, it added a variety of units. Yes, it gave them power. But if you were playing a dwarf campaign pre-rework, you could just mass quarrelers and artillery and demolish everything in your path. Due to the poor casualty replenishment, you might have to fight a lot more battles manually, but that's not really difficulty. Just because you're forced to do so, especially when you're looking at an army of quarrelers and artillery, you would absolutely destroy everything with minimal casualties and take a lot of casualties if you ever dared out-resolve a battle. That's not difficulty. Creative Assembly over the years has tried a large number of things. They've tried things like Realms Divide, they've tried Constant Rebellion, Supply Lines. Any idea you can think of in terms of limitations, they have tried it, and none of those have worked. In every single Total War game that I've played, and I've played since Rome 1, back in the day, not long after, no, I've been playing Total War for almost 20 years now, that has been a consistent issue. The early game is the most challenging portion of the campaign, and the late game doesn't work quite well. Now sure, if you're a player and you're not used to the mechanics of a particular game or Total War in general, then absolutely screwing up in the early game can lead to many problems down the line. But if you do manage the early game, and given a lot of the difficulties front-ended, you'll end up in a dominant position. And that's kind of one of the things. Total War pushes you to dominate the early game, because again, that is the most challenging portion of campaign. But why is that? What are the problems in the early game? What are the problems in the late game? Well, one of the issues has to do with AI scalability. See, in every Total War game, the AI has cheats. On any difficulty you're talking about, even on easy, the AI has cheats. Various economic benefits, casualty replenishment benefits, growth, if we're dealing with that in a game. Regardless, the AI has benefits it's using. But the problem is, it's all front-ended. So the same kind of benefits that it's getting, the percentages, the numbers, the free income, lower upkeep, those are the same benefits that will start with its campaign with, and those are the same benefit it will end the campaign with as well. And that does create a big issue in terms of inverted difficulty. Because while the AI may end up building a large empire and may end up recruiting a lot of different armies, if it does take a lot of territory, it's still operating under the same principles that it did on turn 1. And since you as the player only gain more power as you're playing through the campaign in a way that AI can't match, especially because again, your biggest threat is in the early game, you overcome that, you're forced to overcome that to even get to the mid and late game, you're gonna end up dominating the map. The AI will not keep up with you. It's not a question of AI behavior necessarily or scripting. Sure, the AI is not perfect, it's got a lot of issues. But the bigger problem really boils down to that lack of scalability. And that scalability is not just cheats, it's things like confederations between factions, handling of diplomacy, handling of its wars. Absolutely. But yeah, the lack of confederation is something that does end up hurting the AI. But that's just one of the problems. The second problem to talk about over here is the density of legendary lords in Warhammer 3. Now, this is specifically a Warhammer 3 issue. See, because in the vast majority of campaigns, you have a number of legendary lords to deal with, so does the AI. And they are going to clash. There's going to be a lot of fights between legendary lords. Creative Assembly has set it up so that factions do start close enough to legendary lords that they're going to be hostile with. Take into consideration Karl Franz. He's got Grom, he's got Kemmler, he's got Festus, he's got Vlad and Isabella. Those are a lot of legendary lords that he will clash with. Typically, he will win that, at least on Legendary, but having to deal with those number of threats does mean that Karl Franz's AI potential is limited inherently because of those large number of threats, as opposed to what happens in other parts of the world. I'm sure anyone who's played Immortal Empires has and taken a look at a campaign map with something like Toggle Fog of War or just expanded towards it may notice certain trends, certain factions that just do much better than others. And it's not because those factions and races and lords are significantly better than others, but rather because of their campaign situation. So, Xiao Ming, for instance. In almost every campaign that I play, when I start outside Cafe, I almost always see Xiao Ming ending up dominating this portion of the campaign map. Sometimes it doesn't happen. There's things like faction potential, but that's a randomization at the beginning of a campaign. It's not something. Faction potential might seem like something, oh, it would happen progressively, but really it's just the game deciding, okay, which AI is going to get benefits, especially in auto-resolve. But there's a couple of reasons this happens. One of them does have to do with Cafe's auto-resolve benefit, because Cafe has a lot of heavily armored units. But it's not just heavily armored units. If heavily armored units were the only reason, you'd see Forgrim dominating the campaign map, and more often than not, he gets wiped out. And actually, Queek ends up dominating this portion of the campaign map more often than not, and Skaven certainly are not favored in auto-resolve. No, the reason Xiao Ming ends up dominating his area is because he has no threats. Even without Gelt here, which was added after Thrones of Decay came out, even before Gelt, Xiao Ming was in a position to dominate this area because the only real threat is Snitch, and Skaven don't have good AR. Snitch ends up at war with multiple factions. He ends up losing. Lokir is an issue, but he's far enough away that by the time Lokir and Xiao Ming clash, Lokir is on the back end, and he's also got Nakai to deal with and other factions to deal with as well. So it ends up being Xiao Ming that ends up dominating. Before the addition of Tamarkon, Grimgor would end up dominating and also the rework of Ogres. Now it's kind of 50-50, it depends on the situation. Sometimes Grimgor ends up dominating, like the entirety of the mountains or more. Other times Tamarkon puts him in his place or they have a fight and then Greasus takes advantage of that. Seems a bit wobbly at the moment in this campaign. But regardless, since Warzak's campaign changed position, he's ended up dominating a lot of Camarine and Harkara. In fact, I've seen him often enough in this situation taking control of all of Nehekara. That is ridiculous. But it is because of that lack of natural rivals, that freedom. So that density of legendary lords does affect AI in a way that it doesn't affect the player. For us, it's cool and awesome to fight legendary lords. For the AI, it is a big limiting factor, and it became obvious to me after I played the mod that recreated the Warhammer 1 campaign, which has far lower density of legendary lords, but recreated Warhammer 1's campaign in Warhammer 3, and the legendary lords there ended up being far more powerful and a bigger challenge. So that's the second issue of the late game potential. This doesn't matter about race, like yes, racial design has a role to play, but really, for the most part, I tend to view racial design as like, are you going to be annoyed playing a campaign as opposed to having a fun time? Because you can achieve the same result even with bad races, for a record. I can do more with the dwarves right now by taking advantage of certain things, especially as Grombrindle, but I could do a lot of things with dwarves even pre-patch. That's one of the things worth mentioning. So you have scalability, you have density, you have poor map design, and all of that. On top of that, there is a lack of an endgame. So you have endgame crises, but they're very lackluster and they're not really interesting to deal with at all. They're not a real challenge because, yes, the AI gets high-level lords and armies, but it doesn't have an empire. It doesn't have territory. It doesn't have garrisons. It doesn't have production. So you have a couple of armies to deal with, but once you deal with them, that's it. That's not really a challenge. I think the only one that's interesting is the Chaos Dwarf one because they do get Zarngrund, which is a territory built up, and they do spread around the map, which is interesting in itself. But again, it is that lack of an endgame situation. And CA has tried various things, rogue armies, Attila, barbarians, sea invaders, and Pharaoh. None of those have worked to present a real challenge. I would say it's more important to get the AI scalability up, and having various events, things can happen, interaction between factions, and just campaign interactions to really make that situation work. And then another issue with the endgame, and why it really does suffer in Warhammer 3, has less to do with challenge and just the annoyance of managing a massive empire in a campaign. I'm sure, like most of you, when we're talking about lord skills, hero skills, buildings, 90% of the time you're always going to pick the same options. Sure, you might pick different items, but generally speaking, when you're building a lord, you're going to build them for a particular army, right? Like if you get the Demon Slayer, you will eventually want to get Slayer benefits, even if you don't really want that many Slayers. But really here, I would eventually get Slayers for this army and just make that work with a bunch of Correlers because I've gotten that skill line. All the same, point is, there's a lack of automation. Yes, there is some way of allowing an auto-construction budget, but that auto-construction budget does leave a lot to be desired in terms of how it is handling certain things. Because yes, you can auto-construct buildings, military, all that, high priority, all that, but it is not really a great system. I think it would be a great system to be able to select which skills in advance you want for a lord and how, or for all those types of lords, heroes, what kind of military buildings you want, pre-plan, automate. That would make things more interesting. Because you know what you're going to do, and so it ends up being annoying every single turn to just go through, every lord, every hero, who's leveled up, how they've leveled up, put skills in, use those skills. It just is not a really fun and engaging system. And I would say it does add a lot to the tedium that you feel as a player engaging in a campaign in Warhammer 3. That's my perspective. I think Warhammer 2, one of the things Warhammer 2 did well, it did a lot of things badly, but one of the things also I would just like to add a note, Warhammer 2 was good in the perspective that it would create massive AI empires relatively quickly. Because of the automated confederation between AI-controlled factions within a particular race or multiple races. That's how you got the Order tie. Now, I understand the criticism towards the Order tie. There was too much of the same thing. It was always the same factions like Tyrion, Malekith, Mazdamundi, Karl becoming the big boys. Yes, I get that. I understand that. I comprehend that. It was not a good system. I really do get that. And I do think that's one of the aspects that CA should not have so much abandoned, but improved on. Improved on in the sense that they should have maybe randomized that as opposed to action potential. Randomize that, improve the randomization for that system, made it better, made it work better, as opposed to the kind of nonsense we now get, where factions don't become big and threatening. Part of it, again, density of legendary lords, but part of it is that lack of confederation between AI factions. You do see AI confederations, but very slow and not as often as they should happen. That's all I really had to say on the subject. Like, power creep, it's all well and good to talk about, like, oh, dwarves can recruit thunder by 0p, but those are kind of like, a lot of what people talk about are more surface level issues. The bigger problems, pacing, difficulty scaling, inverted difficulty, AI, confederations, etc. Christine here, signing out.